The sting hit before the sound did. A sharp crack echoed across the glass rooftop of Seabreeze atrium, silencing clinking champagne flutes and freezing every manicured hand mid-toast. Celeste Munro stood stunned, crimson lips split open, one heel sliding back from the force of the slap Preston had just delivered in front of 50 of San Francisco's most powerful elites. For a moment, no one breathed. Preston's hand hovered mid-air, as if even he couldn't comprehend what he'd done. Margaret Donahue's cold gaze flicked across the gathering like a general assessing her troops, calculating, not horrified. And Celeste, still swaying from the impact, slowly straightened. Blood coated her bottom lip. She reached up, dabbed it with the corner of a white linen napkin, then let out a sound so jarring it cracked the party in two. Laughter. Low at first, then sharp and deliberate, her laugh rang out like a bell, clear, unshaken, and terrifyingly composed. "You shouldn't have done that," she said calmly, locking eyes with Preston. She lifted her clutch, pressed her thumb to the hidden panel inside, and felt the subtle vibration that confirmed the signal was sent. Every encrypted file, every bank record, every audio clip detailing Project Indigo and the family's financial crimes had just been delivered to the FBI, SEC, and 3 major media outlets. "Smile for the cameras," she whispered, her voice silk over steel. Around them, phones were still raised, still recording. Preston blinked, stunned. Margaret's mask of elegance cracked for the first time. Somewhere in the distance, a news alert buzzed. Celeste took one slow breath, eyes scanning the stunned room, then smiled, not with triumph, but with inevitability. This was never just a party. It was the reckoning. And it had just begun. By day, Celeste Munro was the face of composure. Stanford Law graduate, lead counsel at Whitlock & Shields, LLP, and the radiant wife of tech heir Preston Donahue. The tabloids loved her, calling her the Silicon Valley Grace Kelly, and Margaret Donahue made sure that image was carefully maintained. Their Pacific Heights mansion, complete with gallery art and imported marble, was more staged than home, but beneath the curated perfection, Celeste lived a double life. Behind a row of evening gowns in her walk-in closet was a concealed compartment, her true office. Inside, burner phones, encrypted hard drives, and a secondary laptop never connected to household Wi-Fi. The closet was the only place in the house untouched by the surveillance system Margaret had gifted them during the renovation. Everyone believed Celeste had seamlessly integrated into the Donahue dynasty, attending fundraisers, hosting political dinners, and posing for magazine spreads. But no one saw the exhaustion in her eyes as she memorized Preston's behavior patterns, or the steel behind her smile as she traced embezzled funds through fake charities. Margaret thought she had groomed the perfect daughter-in-law, Preston the perfect legacy husband, but Celeste had quietly refused to be their puppet. For 5 years, she had played her role flawlessly, nodding on cue, smiling when required. What they didn't realize was that every gala, every whispered command, and every hollow compliment had been recorded, archived, and categorized. The performance was almost over, and Celeste was ready for her final scene. It started with numbers, tiny inconsistencies buried deep in quarterly filings and charitable disbursement reports from the Donahue Charitable Network. Celeste had offered to help Preston review them during a late-night work session, more out of habit than suspicion. But something didn't add up. The same foundation that touted clean water initiatives in Africa had funneled nearly $3,200,000, 0 cents, into a dormant firm registered in the Cayman Islands. She flagged it mentally, quietly made a copy, and didn't say a word. That was the first crack. Then came the changes in Preston. Once warm and playful, he became cold and scripted, especially after private meetings with Margaret. He'd return from their estate retreats dazed, irritable, and robotic in his responses. She noticed how his body would stiffen subtly when Margaret used certain phrases, how his fingers would begin tapping rhythms on tables with no music playing. Celeste's legal mind refused to ignore the pattern. A month later, she discovered an archived invoice marked Executive Health Program that led her to Dr. Gerald Klein, a former neuroscientist turned behavioral consultant. His name reappeared in shell company ledgers, always attached to monthly payments labeled compliance consulting. That's when it clicked. Preston wasn't just manipulated emotionally, he was conditioned, psychologically programmed to obey, react, even love on cue. She'd seen this kind of manipulation used against whistleblowers and employees in her corporate cases, but never imagined it could be done inside a family. That night, while Preston slept beside her like a mannequin, Celeste began the real work, tracking transactions, extracting backups, and initiating contact with federal agents. The rot inside the Donahue legacy wasn't just financial. It was personal, it was human, and it was deeper than she had feared. The illusion of privacy in the Donahue estate shattered 3 months into Celeste's investigation. While reorganizing a built-in bookshelf in the guest study, she noticed something odd, a pinhole-sized lens embedded between the crown molding and the wall sconce, a hidden camera. She tore through every room after that, methodically scanning with a signal detector she had once used on a whistleblower case. The entire house, bedrooms, kitchen, even her private bathroom, had been wired during the so-called security upgrade Margaret insisted on after a break-in scare. It wasn't protection, it was surveillance. Celeste didn't dismantle the cameras, she outwitted them. She reprogrammed the main feed to loop innocuous footage whenever she entered her walk-in closet, creating the only sanctuary where she could think, research, and record freely. But the real horror wasn't what was watching, it was what they had done to Preston. Over time, Celeste began cataloging his unconscious behaviors, a twitch in his left eye when Margaret touched his shoulder, the precise jaw clench when he was told to support the legacy, the flat, affectless voice he used when asked about his childhood. Through recovered invoices and audio transcripts, she uncovered references to Protocol Indigo, a conditioning regimen designed by Dr. Klein, combining pharmaceuticals, audio cues, and negative reinforcement to ensure behavioral compliance. Preston had been groomed since adolescence, rewarded for obedience, punished for deviation. Celeste, a defense attorney trained to spot coercion, realized she was living with a man who had been programmed to be perfect. But even programming has limits. Each time Margaret whispered a command and Preston responded with robotic precision, Celeste documented it, timestamp, location, phrase, reaction. Her case was no longer theoretical, it had faces, names, receipts. She wasn't just building a file, she was building a bomb, and it was almost ready to detonate. The Seabreeze atrium shimmered like a jewel above San Francisco Bay, its glass rooftop bathed in golden dusk light as guests in tuxedos and couture gowns arrived in sleek black cars. Margaret Donahue had orchestrated every detail of Celeste's 40th birthday gala with her usual calculating flair: 50 hand-picked guests, a private string quartet, chandeliers suspended on invisible wires, and a guest list scrubbed of anyone who might genuinely care for Celeste. Absent were her law firm colleagues, her best friend from Stanford, even her first mentor. In their place, senators, judges, CEOs, and board trustees. Every person who had something to lose if the Donahue family fell. Celeste's instructions had been clear. Wear the royal blue gown Preston liked, but instead she arrived in a crimson Dior dress that hugged her like battle armor, her eyes lined in subtle defiance. "You look striking," Preston said, the compliment sounding mechanical. Margaret's smile faltered for just a breath. That was the first win of the night. Hidden in Celeste's clutch was a slim black phone set to record, programmed to transmit its contents with a single press. Her FBI contact had texted earlier, "We're in position, ready when you are." As champagne flowed and greetings blurred into scripted warmth, Celeste moved through the room like a ghost among actors. Every camera lens, every polite smile, every glass raised in toast, she noted it all. The scene had been dressed as celebration, but beneath the orchids and chandeliers, this was a battlefield. The trap was set. Every player was in place. All that remained was the trigger, and Margaret, in her arrogance, would be the one to pull it, thinking she still controlled the narrative. Celeste only needed to wait. Timing, after all, was everything. Dinner had just concluded when Margaret Donahue rose from her seat at the head of the table, her crystal flute catching the candlelight as she tapped it for attention. "Before dessert," she said, her voice warm and commanding, "we must honor our Celeste with something truly memorable." Her gaze swept the semicircle of San Francisco's elite, power players poised like spectators in a royal court. Gifts were wheeled out, wrapped in signature silver and gold, each a symbol of wealth and dominance. Celeste accepted them with perfect poise, her blood-red gown a silent act of rebellion against Margaret's blue dress code. The final gift, a platinum bracelet, clasped around her wrist like a jeweled shackle. Then came the announcement. Margaret, moving with theatrical grace, rested a hand on Preston's shoulder. "Celeste has been a shining example of loyalty," she said, voice dripping with false affection. 5 years of unwavering devotion. The words were code, the precise term written in the family trust. 5 years of stable marriage to unlock the inheritance. Margaret leaned in, whispering something into Preston's ear. Celeste saw it before it happened, the pupils tightening, the jaw locking, the behavioral triggers snapping into place. "You betrayed us," Preston said, voice flat, robotic. "You're working with the feds." Gasps filled the terrace. Celeste didn't move. Then, without warning, his hand struck her. The crack silenced the night. Her body pitched sideways, hitting the marble table with a sickening thud. Blood filled her mouth. Phones were still raised, still recording. And from the floor, dazed but calm, Celeste let out a single eerie laugh. Not weakness, not hysteria. Precision. "Perfect timing," she murmured through a split lip, thumb pressing her clutch. The message sent, the reckoning triggered, every secret was about to burn. Celeste rose slowly, crimson Dior streaked with blood, her laugh still echoing like a strange hymn of truth cutting through a sea of stunned silence. "You all saw that, didn't you?" she asked calmly, her voice carrying with courtroom clarity. "And you recorded it. Excellent." Around her, guests, senators, CEOs, judges, stood frozen, unsure whether to sit, speak, or run. Margaret's expression twisted in confusion, realizing this moment wasn't unfolding according to her carefully rehearsed narrative. Celeste reached into her clutch and pulled out the phone, the one already transmitting its payload. "You've just witnessed the activation of a behavioral trigger, a man programmed since adolescence to protect a fortune with violence." She turned to the crowd. "What Preston did was horrible, but what's worse is why he did it." Guests instinctively checked their phones. Headlines were already breaking. Donahue family under federal investigation, allegations of psychological conditioning and financial crimes. Celeste continued, unmoved. "You're all familiar with the Donahue charitable network, the clean image, the philanthropic empire. What you didn't know was that it's been used to launder nearly $400 million 0 cents through offshore accounts, and more disturbingly, to fund Project Indigo, a psychological conditioning program." She gestured toward Preston, now visibly trembling, staring at his own hand like it didn't belong to him. "This man was turned into a puppet, and the woman pulling the strings stands right there." All eyes turned to Margaret. Her carefully constructed smile cracked just slightly. Phones rose higher. A federal agent stepped onto the rooftop, flanked by another in a dark suit. "Mrs. Donahue," he said, "we need to speak with you." And with that, the night meant for celebration became a courtroom in the sky. The empire had begun to fall, and Celeste was holding the match. The aftermath was instant and irreversible. Margaret Donahue, once the untouchable queen of San Francisco society, stood paralyzed as federal agents stepped forward, presenting a warrant with quiet finality. Her polished composure shattered as her diamond-studded hand trembled, reaching for stability that no longer existed. Around her, the crowd began to scatter, judges whispering into phones, senators excusing themselves, high-profile donors backing toward the elevator as if proximity might stain them. Preston had collapsed into a chair, head in hands, mumbling fragments of childhood memories. Lake House, lessons with Dr. Klein. always watching. For the first time in years, his voice held raw, unfiltered fear. Margaret tried to speak, to command order, but even her most loyal allies were peeling away. Celeste stood at the center of it all, the blood on her lip now dry, her eyes steely with the weight of 5 years' worth of evidence finally exposed. "You did this to him," she said coldly, stepping between mother and son. "You rewired his mind like a circuit board to protect your fortune." The agents confiscated phones, tablets, briefcases. Dr. Klein, white-faced and silent, had already begun murmuring to an agent, the beginning of a cooperation deal forming. Margaret lunged for control one last time, snapping, "This is a family matter," but was cut off by Agent Rivera's firm reply. "This is a federal crime scene." The Donahue empire, once wrapped in prestige and influence, was unraveling thread by thread, revealed not by an outsider, but by the woman they thought they had owned. And as Margaret was led away in silence, her legacy wasn't one of power or prestige, but of secrets, cruelty, and the spectacular downfall that followed. The ashes were still warm, but the fire had already moved on. 6 months after the rooftop reckoning, Celeste Monroe sat in the back row of the federal courtroom, watching as Margaret Donahue entered in handcuffs, the ever-present armor of couture replaced by a stark prison-issued jumpsuit. The courtroom buzzed with reporters, former employees, and those once silenced by NDAs and intimidation tactics. The prosecution, armed with Celeste's meticulously organized files, presented a case so airtight it left Margaret's defense scrambling. Whistleblower statements, forensic accounting records, psychological evaluations, each piece painted a damning portrait of decades-long abuse, disguised as legacy building. Preston, absent from the courtroom, remained under treatment at a trauma recovery center, finally deprogramming from years of cognitive manipulation. Though once her tormentor, Celeste now saw him for what he truly was, another victim of Margaret's obsession with control. In a quiet gesture of atonement, Preston had redirected his share of the trust to Celeste's newly launched Cognitive Liberty Legal Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to representing victims of psychological coercion and financial control. Within months, Celeste's firm had taken on dozens of clients, from manipulated heirs to silenced whistleblowers. She partnered with neuroscientists, trauma experts, and legal scholars to push for legislation recognizing cognitive abuse as a prosecutable crime. What had started as a personal mission had become a national movement. Celeste's own transformation was profound. No longer just the elegant figurehead in designer heels, she had become a force of reckoning for those robbed of autonomy. The courtroom's fluorescent lights didn't flatter anyone, but, as the sentence was read, 27 years for racketeering, coercion, fraud, and conspiracy, Celeste sat upright, calm, and quietly satisfied. She had taken down one of the most powerful families in California, not with threats or violence, but with the truth, with precision, and with the law. As Margaret was led away, the last thread of the Donahue illusion unraveled, and Celeste, finally free from their grip, stepped outside into the morning sun, not as someone's wife or someone's project, but as the architect of justice. Her life was no longer a performance, it was her own. The red dress still hung in the back of Celeste Monroe's closet, carefully preserved, not as a symbol of wealth or fashion, but as armor from the night she dismantled an empire. 6 months had passed since Margaret Donahue was sentenced, and the fallout continued to ripple across San Francisco's elite. Board members resigned, foundations collapsed, but Celeste had moved on, not to escape the past, but to rebuild something better from its wreckage. She had resigned from Whitlock and Shields, unable to return to corporate defense after witnessing how deeply corruption could entrench itself behind polished veneers. Instead, she dedicated herself fully to the Cognitive Liberty Legal Foundation, where her experience gave voice to those who had none. Preston had reached out, tentatively, cautiously, from his recovery center, sending articles about deprogramming and legal reforms. He no longer wore bespoke suits or parroted Margaret's doctrine. Instead, he signed over his remaining assets to support Celeste's mission, saying simply, "What broke me might free others." Celeste didn't know what the future held for Preston, or if forgiveness was possible, but she knew this: she no longer needed closure from him. Her power no longer depended on anyone's apology. What mattered was the legacy she was creating, one of truth, autonomy, and protection. Standing before her window overlooking the bay, Celeste often touched the bracelet she once received as a birthday gift, now repurposed, melted down, and forged into the nameplate on her office door. It read, "Celeste Monroe, founder, advocate, survivor." The red dress was never about rebellion, it was about resurrection. And with each case she took on, each voice she helped liberate, she honored not the pain she endured, but the woman she chose to become. The performance was over, the curtain had fallen, and Celeste was finally living her truth. Celeste Monroe's story teaches us that true strength comes from reclaiming your voice, even when the world expects your silence. She turned years of quiet endurance into a calculated stand for justice, proving that the most powerful revenge is exposing the truth. Her red dress wasn't rebellion, it was rebirth. In facing her abuser publicly and dismantling an empire built on lies, she showed that healing isn't just personal, it's transformational. The lesson is clear: even in a world designed to control you, truth, resilience, and courage can shatter any illusion and rebuild something far more powerful: freedom.